Okay, I'm going to try and make my way through this without running out of the door and screaming down the street. I have a very low tolerance for fear scary films. But luckily, Kim and Anna have a very high tolerance for scary films. But my first question, before we start seeing some clips, Kim and Anna have chosen what they think are some of the best horror movies ever made in various different types of subgenres. I'd be interested to know what you all think, so get ready for the audience participation. Before we see some clips, I'm going to start with Anna. I'm not sure whether the title of this session is What's the Best Horror Movie Ever Made or What's the Scariest? Is there a difference between those two things?
Absolutely. Because, I would even argue that what is the point of discussing what is the best movie ever made or what is the best horror or any genre ever made? Because there's so many different ways to approach it. And that's kind of the beauty of it. When people often say, oh, I'm not into horror, it's not for me. I'm like, okay, but are you just thinking of gore? Are you just thinking of jump scares? Are you just thinking of the specific thing that you don't like? Because there's so many different flavors and types of filmmaking within horror that you can always find a little flavor that works for you. And then the thing that I always, the second question I would always posit is it successful because it scares you, which is what we kind of expect from a horror film, in which case, if a film actually manages to truly, truly terrify or scare you, I'm not talking about kind of jump scares or special effects or kind of gross out stuff. I'm talking about genuinely get under your skin. That shows you something about your own fears and your own anxieties that perhaps you're not even comfortable talking out or saying out loud or discussing with anybody else. And that's the really interesting stuff for me. So for me, the most successful horror film is the one that actually truly scares you in a deep way that you might not even be comfortable discussing, not just kind of in polite company, but in any company. The one that kind of makes you go, yeah, okay, I've just seen that and I kind of want to go be by myself right now. It's not necessarily always the fun type.
It's tapping into something on some level. Yeah, really fascinating. Kim, slightly different question to you.
Good.
Tell me why you love it.
The question I always hear under that question is, why are you a freak? Right? Now, my response...
I would ask the same question to people who love musicals,
fair enough. But those guys are really sick. I'll put it like this. In his communications with the police and the FBI, the Zodiac Killer did not talk about horror films. He talked about the Mikado, the Gilbert and Sullivan opera, which apparently was a big favorite of the Zodiac Killer. It's thought that he also might quite have liked The Most Dangerous Game, which is a horror movie and is just out on Blu-ray with a commentary track by me. It's a corollary to what Anna said, which is, I think everybody likes a certain type of horror in the way that people have a sense of humor. You may like carry-on films. You may like Noel Coward comedies. There's a wealth of difference. You may like, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You may like subtle M.R. James ghost stories. Everybody has something that creeps under their skin. I'm actually interested in the whole panoply of horror. I find the various approaches and methods and the meanings that we take out of horror films. I mean, I spent some time yesterday at the Somerset House exhibition, the horror show, which is sort of interesting. It comes at horror from the perspective of non-genre art, and looking at there's this real tension between two approaches to horror. One is the sense that monsters, which extends to ghosts, witches, vampires, whatever, are admirable rebels against an evil system, and that we look at horror. And I believe I've selected Frankenstein as one of the clips, and that's a film where I think almost nobody identifies with torch-bearing peasants. Yeah, right. I mean, it's like, I'm sorry, the whole point of the story of Frankenstein is that we identify with the monster. We are the monster. But on the other hand, there's Dracula. Now, I kind of worry about people who would identify with Dracula or Nosferatu, but I can actually see why. There are elements there. So there are monsters we find admirable, monsters we find terrifying, and monsters we're tempted by. We're tempted to wear the skin. I always think it's a real cop-out at the end of The Lost Boys or Near Dark, where people have been a vampire for about 20 minutes, and then they're allowed to go back to normal. I think, no. You commit all the way to being a monster if you do, and you accept the murderous guilt that comes along with that. If you can live with that, then you are a monster. And I think that maybe the point of horror is to address this question of what is a monster?
Interesting. When we came up with the concept for this evening, we were really trying to sort of play around with what we could and couldn't juxtapose, and we were worried about taste and decency and things. And even in just these first two answers to the question about horror films, I can absolutely see that we've been vindicated with our opening conversation about the monsters in Downing Street, and now we're talking about the real fears that are being tapped into. So I feel pleased.
Really fascinating that Kim has kind of tapped into, and I have this conversation over and over again in these types of panels, in press and podcasts, whatnot. And I think genuinely, I can't think of another genre that has this underlying question of what is wrong with you that you like it. Literally, if nobody attacks anyone else by saying, what's wrong? Who hurt you that you like comedy films so much? Or like, are you okay just because you like
maybe
romance
gaming?
films?
Violent gaming has a bit of a similar sort of snobbishness about it.
And rap and all kinds of. There's always some despised art form. The kind of thing that kids are listening to, you're not supposed to like. But it's like, who wants to listen to a rock and roll band your parents like?
Absolutely not.
And the same's true. The most despised art form of the 20th century was horror comics. There were literal political campaigns, broad church campaigns. In Britain, it was run by the Communist Party. In America, it was run by right-wing Christians to eradicate the whole idea of horror comics. Well into the 1980s, when you came into Britain, there was a list at the customs of things you could not import, and horror comics was right up there as a thing. That is the most out there beyond thing. I mean, it's like, punk rock is nothing compared to the point where people who worked in comic books in the 1950s were ashamed to admit it at parties, because the movement against them was, much more extensive and targeted than the movement against video nasties in the 1980s, which was a similar moral panic. And the fact that horror is. It's not the only genre that can provoke this kind of repressive instinct. Obviously, pornography does as well, but it is the most interesting of them. The tension between the things you're allowed to say or watch and what other people who are not interested in them wish you wouldn't.
Stand outside and judge you in some way. Fascinating.
No one tries to stop you watching Carry On films.
No one can stop us watching some clips from horror films either, so we're going to do that now. Let's start with Frankenstein, Kim, which is one of the ones that you've picked in the monster horror category. Let's just have a little look at old Frank. Goodness.
That last line was cut out in Britain and was unheard for about 50 years.
Wow.
Now I know what it's like to be God. Which again shows a button that is being pressed. It's almost like this. The catchphrase of the horror genre is there. It's alive. There was a film in the 70s called It's Alive. But it's in theory, that's a reassuring statement, isn't it? But the fact that it's the indefinite article rather than the definite one. He's alive or she's alive. That's happy, isn't it? It's alive is alarming.
Oh my goodness me. Yeah, absolutely not. Anna, you picked for your best pick in the monster horror category, a film I haven't seen called Ginger Snaps. Has anybody seen Ginger Snaps? Oh, yes, hands going up.
My people.
Tell us a little, my people, there we go. We're going to see a clip in just a second. Tell us a bit about Ginger Snaps. What's the
Ginger
deal?
Snaps is a Canadian teen horror film from the year 2000, where essentially as the same day the titular Ginger gets her period, she also gets attacked and turned into a werewolf.
Oh, that can happen. yeah. Okay, let's have a little look at Ginger Snaps. Oof.
It's very good.
Teen Wolf, it ain't.
It's better.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's fascinating. So in all of that, and there's a huge monster genre. There's tons and tons and tons of them, but that's the one that really gets you. Tell us why.
Well, I find even the whole idea of the category of a monster movie to be incredibly elastic. So in the BFI season, in Dreams and Monsters, essentially we're looking at the whole history of horror films through these 5 monster archetypes. You know, there's the vampire, there's the beast, you know, the werewolf is one of the types of beasts. There's the ghost, there's the zombie, there's the witch. So all of these kind of mythological or supernatural archetypes have existed pretty much since the very beginning of horror cinema, and are consistently shifting shape. So, you know, the witch of the 1920s is not the witch of the 1970s, it's not the witch of the 1990s. And the fact that they keep persisting and we keep going back to these archetypes that keep involving them tells us so much more. It tells us a lot about the structures and the type of filmmaking in which those films were born, and also about the audiences that were watching them. You know, how we think about The Craft, or how we think about The Wolfman versus Ginger Snaps. You know, not this grown man turning into a wolf with a hairy chest kind of bursting out of a shirt, but a Canadian teenage girl who is much more into Gothic literature and filming kind of weird, morbid videos with her sister, who suddenly gets turned into a werewolf. It's completely different interpretations of the same type of monster. So that's the beauty of that category, is that you can think, you know, monsters that walk around us almost like humans, almost in a seductive way, like the vampire. That's always been a very essentially an archetype that is very closely related to sex, and you know, it's a human but not quite. And then there's these completely inhuman creatures like the werewolf, or there's a really fantastic Polish mermaid horror film where the mermaid is made into something monstrous and very much not Disney-fied. So when you think about monster movies, it can literally be anything from Frankenstein to Ginger Snaps to, you know, this huge creature that erupts from the sea, like in Host.
Totally fascinating. You're really selling it to me. I feel like I am going to go home and watch the box set of Nightmare on Elm Street films. I'm tempted to show in this sort of daft list of categories, best international horror. It sounds like a sort of low rent Oscars, but you both chose the same movie in international horror category, which is it called Ring or The Ring? Ring.
It's called Ring.
It's the one where the horrible woman comes out of the telly.
The remake is called The Ring.
Okay.
Which is handy.
The original. Okay, let's have a look at the clip of the original Japanese Ringu, not Pingu. Oh dear. Kim, that one that she comes, is it that something if you watch the film, she comes for you, so we can see what they're doing there. Oh, after a week.
Yeah, you get a week of increasing evil omens before Sadako, as it is, gets you. It's a very specifically Japanese film in terms of what the ghost is. That long black hair and the white dress is very like the classical Japanese ghost. But it's also rather a lot like Susan Hill's novel, The Woman in Black, which is another one. If you see her, you're going to die, or some children will die around you. What's scary about it is the randomness of it. The personal thing, Ring and the Blair Witch Project, which came out a year or so later, are for me absolutely the last movies that I first saw on video cassettes that people sent me. In both cases, distributors or filmmakers sent me cassettes before anyone had heard of these things. And they're both films that depend on that kind of reach. Yes. Both of them are films that have such a build-up, a reputation that many people are disappointed and watch him say, oh, is that all there is? Well, I'd say when you just opened an envelope and shoved it into your machine, the amount of freaking out that came from it.
Have you ever looked away?
Not recently.
No. Anna, have you ever looked away?
No.
Oh my God, these people are incredible.
I want to see behind the veil.
Yeah,
that's
for sure.
That's the point.
For sure. Okay, I'm going to pick another one.
What's the first sentence of the Book of Revelations?
What is the first sentence of the Book of Revelation?
Come and see, which is actually a brilliant movie as well.
It is a different type of horror.
Yeah, but I know when Time Out did a list of the top 100 horrors, Come and See was in it, and a lot of horror fans were furious because they got 99%. They'd not bothered to go and see that film.
So tell us about the Come and See. I don't know about that movie.
It's a really gruesome war film about the Second World War. I mean, it is terrifying.
War film from the late 60s?
Yeah, maybe a bit later, but it's shattering.
We asked you to come up with the best horror film for people who don't like horror films, or kind of a beginner's horror film. And I was really surprised at your choice, Kim. You just teased me about it because of course it's a horror film, but you picked There Will Be Blood.
Yeah.
Is it a horror film? Does it feel like a horror film to you?
It's
I don't
not
know.
just a horror film, but it is a horror film. What's the title? It's what it I use it as a test case. Apocalypse Now is another one that sort of fits in. Horror isn't necessarily a genre, it's a mode of discourse. If you look at next time you look at There Will Be Blood, look at how it's lit, at the music score, at the style of acting. It's full of vampire jokes. It's full of vampire, all that I drink your milkshake stuff. And even the oil that comes out the ground and corrupts everyone. It's treated like The Blob in that 1950s science fiction movie. And it does end with a gruesome act of murder. The destruction of Mr. Sunday. And shot in a house where a real fascinating murder took place in the 1930s as well. The Doheny Mansion, which threads throughout Raymond Chandler's work.
Interesting. I mean, it's certainly a very unsettling and frightening movie, and not at all what I was expecting when I went to see it. So everything you say made sense. Anna, you picked Good Manners, a movie called Good Manners. Tell us about Good Manners, then we'll see a clip in a second.
Weirdly, it's another werewolf movie. This time a Brazilian one. It's one of these quite recent film. It's very underseen, at least in the UK, and it saddles kind of a drama and a monster movie incredibly beautifully. There's a love story at the heart of it, and I don't really want to say much more because it's one of those films that doesn't have any of the things that people who call themselves averse to horror have, and instead it's a family drama and a love story. There just happens to be some quite gruesome body horror, maybe a little bit of werewolf business going on in there.
Sure, standard family stuff, really.
But isn't it, to echo, Kim's pick, isn't it all about positioning? If someone sold you There Will Be Blood just based on the title and the premise as a horror movie, you would buy it as a horror movie. If I sold you Good Manners as a award-winning, festival-favored Brazilian drama about family, you'd be like, oh yeah, that sounds great. But if I sell it to you as a Brazilian werewolf movie, you'd be like, it's not for me.
Yeah.
So it all depends on how we pitch these things, which is why the genre is so incredibly flexible.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Let's have a little look at Good Manners and we'll judge if it's a horror movie or a Brazilian werewolf family drama.
Isn't he cute?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And that is a very, very compelling trailer style. Like, you would go and see that movie. It's completely bizarre and fascinating. Who knew? Okay, I'm going to talk about horror franchises because that's, for the uninitiated, and you're obviously clever and you know all the niche stuff and the obscure stuff and the intelligent, clever things. And then there's the big posters outside the View Cinema down the road, number 7, number 8, number 9, number 10 in the franchise. And you, Kim, picked Final Destination as the best franchise. Now, we're really talking, I loved Final Destination, amazing movie. Talk to us about Final Destination, we'll see a clip.
Right. I actually think this is the most underrated franchise as well, partly because it doesn't quite have a poster boy like the Masked Killers and Halloween or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th. It does have, it's Tony Todd, who also is Candyman in the Candyman franchise. It plays an undertaker in the first film, and his voice recurs. So he is the figure of death. But it's the most simple franchise. It's basically about kids who escape death. They don't get on a plane that crashes, and then death comes and claims them. It's an old urban legend type story. But what it basically is one joke told over and over and over.
Yeah,
It reminds me a lot of the of Chuck Jones's great Roadrunner and Coyote cartoons,
totally.
which ran for like 30 years on one joke. But it's a great joke.
It's a great
and
joke.
I think I think Final Destination is up to something like 6. They did that thing of numbering them and then calling one The Final Destination. And there's a Final Destination 3D in there as well, which is fun. But the level of quality throughout, though, it doesn't have the dips that, say, Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, they all have real stinkers in there. Friday the 13th is mostly real stinkers. But all the Final Destination films, they are interchangeable. But actually, if you watch them in order, they fit together perfectly. They have that serpent swallowing its tail feel. But I don't know which horrible death you have picked, but the basic premise of ingenious mousetrap type deaths, of bizarre freak accidents, even freakier than the ones in the Omen series, I find irresistible. It is it's more comedy horror than horror horror.
It's very
Although
funny.
underlying it, there is a thing about teenagers confronting mortality. But that's, again, something that's in almost all franchise-type horror, multiplex horror.
I think about it every time I get on a plane. The little spinny thing, when he notices. Every single time. And also, Final Destination, I remember for the campaign, it had the audience reactions in the marketing campaign, because it's such a shock when the bus comes at the end. Let's see a clip from Final Destination, then we'll talk to Anne about her pick. It's his premonition. It didn't happen. It is brilliant. Anna, you did pick Halloween.
I did.
Which Kim slightly dissed in his setup.
I'm happy to diss it as well because it has many dips.
Okay.
I do, perhaps because it's fresh in my mind because of Halloween Ends having just come out.
Yeah, okay.
And I've done a lot of coverage of the Halloween franchise and been thinking about it a lot. I'm almost fascinated by the Halloween franchise as the possibility of it, instead of what actually happened. Very, very famously, there's the one that is now being reclaimed as Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, which is the sliding doors moment for the entire franchise. The idea being when Halloween 1 was so massively successful in 78, and it is a perfect movie, I believe. And then there was a very quick sequel, just very inventively titled just Halloween 2, which picks up immediately after the events of the first one. And the third movie is a completely different set of characters. And what was the original idea was going to be there's be a franchise of films, completely different, with totally different characters and stories, but all set on the day of Halloween.
Oh, I see. Okay.
With all of the spookiness and the possibilities of storytelling that holiday alone can conjure up. But everybody hated Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, and they were like, give us back Michael Myers. So then began a several movie long dip in quality. There was runes involved. It got very strange. Donald Pleasance got increasingly more unhinged as the franchise went on. And then there was the reboots. There was all the reboots. There's the unthinkably bad reboots done by Rob Zombie in the mid-late 2000s. And then once again, the franchise gained relevance, cultural relevance, with the most recent trilogy, with again the confusingly titled Halloween, just Halloween again. But 40 years later. So Halloween 2018, Halloween Kills, Halloween Ends, completely erases a lot of what has already happened in the franchise. And it's like, you know what, guys, that was not good. So we're just going to redo everything.
Something else. Yeah.
And it's the same core characters. And I find Laurie Strode in particular fascinating because she, accepting the Rob Zombie movies, has always been played by the same performer, by Jamie Lee Curtis. And the fact that in 2018, they bring her back as, this very tortured, very unlikable, extremely paranoid older woman, that is not the poster child for a slasher film of any kind in any decade. And it's seeing what happened after the movie ends is what made me really love this kind of new interpretation. Variant in quality as those three films are, the core idea of it was so simple and brilliant. And the performance by Curtis is so fascinating and layered. And just the sheer audacity of a woman in her 60s leading and absolutely annihilating this franchise, I really loved and made it, reluctantly relevant again.
I think the clip we've picked is from the original one, the 1978 one, I think. So let's have a look at a bit of an effect movie. There she is.
Little montage there.
Little montage. Nice work, Connor. Okay, we're into the last 5 minutes, so we've got to bring out the big guns. We did do the really annoying thing that you'd never want to do, which is to pick a favourite. There's one here that I think everybody will be familiar with, horror fan or not. And then there's one that I genuinely have never, ever heard of. So it's a good fight for us to pick a favourite out of these two movies. Anna, you go first because you are pitching...
What did I pick?
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh, great.
Everybody's heard of Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah, and I picked that kind of partly for personal reasons, because that is my foundational horror. And I love asking people, both horror fans and non-horror fans, what their foundational memory of a horror film is. Everybody has one.
Yeah.
Whether it traumatized them into, building a career around the genre or traumatized them into never, ever watching a horror film ever again. Everybody has that one film that they remember. And that image is transformed through your memory, through age. So sometimes even if you don't revisit that film for years or decades, you still remember it more vividly than any other film in your entire life. And that film for me was A Nightmare on Elm Street. I watched it because my cousin put it on for me at age 9, and I had about nightmares for a month. Very vivid nightmares, convinced that Freddy was underneath my bed and stuff. And then the minute he disappeared, I was like, no, I kind of miss him. I would like some more. And it never stopped, kind of the love for horror movies. So I always go back to this one because I could go into the production history and how inventive the filmmaking is and the absolutely unbeatable simplicity and coolness of the premise of a serial killer beyond the grave haunting and killing teenagers in their sleep. The idea of a killer or any kind of monster being able to get to you in your safest of safe places, not just in your slumber, but in your bedroom, in your parents' house, in your home, is terrifying and it's very core. And then, all the Wes Craven filmmaking choices, the special effects, all of it has aged incredibly well. The potency of the film just does not go away. And also it's very personally important for me. So that's my pick.
Good pitch. Let's watch a bit of Freddy.
Please, God. This is God. Watch this.
The most gruesome scene.
Yeah. Thanks, Connor. It's really frightening. It's properly, genuinely frightening. I mean, that bit with the fingers is a bit silly. We all laugh at that, obviously. But
isn't it terrifying, the idea that, because Freddy also, I think, it was toned down in the first one.
Yeah.
But Freddy is a child molester and a serial killer, horrible. And he is murdered by this alliance of parents who are like, the justice system will do nothing, will let him go. So we take justice into our own hands. So Freddy is actually a vengeful ghost, who's there to avenge his murder. But he is such a despicable character, both in life and in death. Yeah. And in death, he seems to enjoy these otherworldly powers so much that he is incredibly gross as a character. Yeah. Someone who's reveling so much in being so disgustingly evil and horrible.
There was a touch of the Liz Truss's about his funny walk as well. Do you know what I mean? Hadn't noticed that. Kim, we're going to close with your top pick, which is a movie which I've never heard of, called Let's Scare Jessica to Death. I'm sorry for Jessica if she's here. Who's seen Let's Scare Jessica to Death? Anyone? Couple of people at the front. Go on, Kim.
My foundational horror film is Dracula, the Bela Lugosi film, but for me, Dracula is an incarnation of evil rather than terror. I mean, I've been sort of obsessed and reworked the figure in my own work for years. But I picked this film, again, because I saw it at a particularly formative age. In the early 70s, when I was like 12, 13, I realized that I could get into X certificate films. Oh. And so, would change out of my school uniform with our mates, lower the voice. So, one ticket, please. And I really, truly believed that the cashier didn't think we were under 18. But anyway, they sold us tickets. And the first couple of horror films I saw theatrically were things like Dr. Phibes Rises Again, Dracula AD 1972, Frogs, which are great fun. They're all movies that I unreservedly love to this day, but they're kind of thrill rides. And then this movie, Let's Scare Jessica to Death, came to the local cinema. I'd never heard of it. Unlike the other, it doesn't have Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing or Vincent Price or anybody in it. The director was somebody I'd not heard of. It had a kind of classy but enigmatic poster. And so I went and saw this thing with my gang of friends, and we came out terrified white. It was the first horror film that genuinely terrified me. Some of it was for personal reasons. It's the family in Let's Scare Jessica to Death did their situation is very close to my own family situation. My family moved out of the city and bought a rundown farmhouse in the country and did it up to they were potters to create a pottery. But we went through quite a lot of difficulty with the locals and also just moving into an old house. And this film, that's not actually the whole thrust of the movie, but of course, you take away from films what you relate to. Yeah. And for decades afterwards, it was one of those films that even other horror fans hadn't seen. I would say, The Exorcist, that's kind of scary, but Let's Scare Jessica to Death, that'll really screw you up. In recent years, in fact, it's playing in your season, isn't it? In recent years, it has been rediscovered a bit, and I'm not the only person who likes this movie. I'm still one of its biggest boosters, I suspect.
There's going to be another 80 people who are fans of this movie. Let's watch a clip of Jessica.
Yeah.
Stay. Stay. Stay, Jessica. Stay. You're home now. You're home now.
Oh, creepy. It looks quite brilliant, really.
The whole film is like that.
Is it?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to explain the actual story. But I think actually one of the things that emerges from horror sometimes, if you've seen the American remake of The Ring, you'll understand the plot, but you won't be as terrified as if you see the Japanese film, which leaves a whole lot of stuff unexplained. Sometimes, and this is an issue with big studio horror, where executives want to develop the script and they come in and they ask questions like, how does the monster get across town with nobody seeing him to turn up in the girl's bedroom and say, we don't care about that. Audiences don't want the joke explained. They want the joke. And sometimes the best horror is just simply being confronted with the weird and the irrational and the surreal. And Jessica, on the one hand, it's actually a vampire movie, but it's also a haunted house story. But its approach isn't quite like the approach of traditional Gothic horror. It's also sort of American indie cinema. You can see its influence in David Lynch's films, all those kind of films, which again, they're not quite horror, but somehow they disturb you more than the average Friday the 13th sequel.
You have both been absolutely, completely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed it. I thought I was going to hate every minute of it and find it slightly hard work and have to pretend, but I've been totally spellbound. You've really made me think, and I've made a ton of notes. I feel like we could do another one of these and another one of these. I'm not going to make you do boos and screams for your favourite horror movie, because I feel like that would be undermining all the clever things that these people have just taught us about this really fascinating genre. So thank you so much for being with us. I hope you're all feeling suitably got the jitters, because Vanessa Wolf is about to come on stage and tell us a really genuinely terrifying live ghost story. Do not miss it. We're going to squish the break between this session and the next one. So if you really need the loo, dash and get it, grab a drink, and we were going to go pretty much straight into the next session. Thank you so much, everyone.